Thanks very much for the invitation. A real pleasure. The title of the presentation is on the screen, and these are my disclosures. So I don't have any direct financial conflicts of interest that I need to declare. We receive funding from public agencies. One intellectual conflict that I have is certainly that I co-chair and co-founded the GREAT Working Group that is a big part of this presentation. And there's many colleagues that I need to acknowledge, but former PhD student of mine, Rebecca Morgan, and a co-worker in the GREAT Working Group, Emily Sennert, certainly should be acknowledged. I work at McMaster University currently, which is in Canada, and for us it is important to acknowledge that McMaster University actually sits on traditional territories of the Mississauga and Tudesini nations, and that the land is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. That is an acknowledgement of the indigenous people that obviously were there before us. So today's talk is about considerations for identifying the best body of evidence related to exposure studies. I'm an epidemiologist by training and an internist by training. But most of my work is really more in the clinical epidemiology field, so this is always triggering lots of thoughts and very stimulating. I will present great thoughts on assessing risk of bias across a body of evidence. You had presentations about assessing individual studies, and some of the other presentations will focus on individual studies. And then I'm going to briefly talk about how to use evidence about exposures in decision-making, and talk briefly about the GREAT evidence-to-decision frameworks. So for those of you who are not familiar with GREAT, let me quickly see who has never heard about GREAT. Feel free to raise your arm. So I would say that's about 5 to 10%, 10% maybe of the audience. So GREAT is a method, system, or approach to operationalize really two big pieces. One is the assessment of the certainty in a body of evidence that answers a particular question. That can be a prognostic question, it can be an exposure question, it can be an intervention question. To operationalize the criteria and process for making transparent decisions and recommendations. It's used in systematic reviews, health technology assessments, guidelines, coverage decisions, and so forth. It's used by big organizations, but this is pretty much all that I'm going to say about the background of GREAT. GREAT is applied in the context of evidence synthesis. This is from a paper that Rebecca first authored, and obviously a few other people that work in the risk assessment arena, where we laid out the process for how GREAT fits into this whole approach of when you have a question about whether or not an exposure causes a specific outcome. It starts with building what we call, and I think most of you call, a PECO, or population exposure comparisons and outcomes question, a protocol that should define exposure assessment and any related outcomes that are of interest. It leads to identifying eligible studies in an evidence synthesis, such as a systematic review, and those that are not eligible. It means to define individual study-level target experiments if you use instruments like Robbins-E that you heard about. And we are trying to identify studies that obviously minimize risk of bias. I think this pointer will work, yes. And of course, once we have identified studies that may be eligible to answer a specific question, there will be a risk of bias assessment of exposure studies. There will be a risk of bias judgment per study perhaps, but I'll get back to that. We suggest that you do sensitivity analyses and do these sensitivity analyses by domain. I'll also explain that a little bit more. And that at the end of the day, if you really want to answer a question based on the best available evidence, it starts with determining the final risk of bias for the body of evidence that fulfills the inclusion criteria before it's integrated in an overall assessment of the certainty that includes other domains that I will not necessarily spend a lot of time on today. When going back to this particular slide, when we started this work, we said, okay, we need good questions. But at the same time, we realized, or I realized that there was no good approach or no good framework for formulating questions about exposures because they are complicated, as you know. So then we set out with Rebecca to develop this framework that is used quite widely now, or at least has received a lot of attention for formulating good questions to evaluate an exposure of an environmental or other exposures and health outcomes. And essentially what happened was that we didn't have a guiding framework, as I already said, to operationalize that PECO approach. And for the types of PECO questions that researchers and decision makers were probably interested in, there were lots of challenges around doing this in terms of identifying exposures and potential comparators to understand if a risk exists. And we ended up with 5 paradigmatic approaches and examples for identifying the exposure and comparator in systematic reviews and in particular related to decision making. These 5 approaches are described here. They start with just understanding of whether or not there is a dose-response relationship, there's some questions that you can formulate about whether or not certain cutoffs or thresholds are related to outcomes, down to evaluating the potential effect of using specific exposure cutoffs or levels in intervention studies to understand whether or not health outcomes are affected and how they are affected. There are some in this particular paper, so some of it today is some about describing papers that are, or examples that are relevant for that context. So we did that in order to formulate these questions, and then a brief recap about the determinants of the certainty of a body of evidence in grade. So a body of evidence in exposure assessment starts as high certainty evidence. There are 5 factors that across a body of evidence can lower the certainty. One is risk of bias, and here we really are talking about internal validity, or a better word maybe study design and execution, which includes the analysis. And obviously in the exposure field, it's difficult to randomize. That may lead to greater attention to confounding bias, which is integrated in the risk of bias domain. Inconsistency between studies that should be showing the same results but are not showing the same results is the second factor that we are looking at. Indirectness, which basically has to do with how well does the evidence that is represented there in terms of a population, that should be an E, the exposure, the comparators, and the outcomes, can be also an I, relate to the question of interest. So how does the research evidence support us in drawing conclusions about whether or not the findings are applicable? Imprecision is the 4th criterion, publication bias, the 5th criterion, and then there are 3 factors that increase or may increase the certainty in the evidence when there are very large effects. That means that we can probably assume that an effect is beyond a certain threshold that may be relevant for decision making. Opposing plausible bias, residual bias, including confounding bias, and dose response gradients. So that's great in a nutshell. I will be obviously focusing out of these 8 domains of factors on risk of bias. So in grade, really any risk of bias tool can be used. Of course, it is ideal that if you assess a study, that the tool that you use is validated and that it covers the items of interest. That is obvious. And Robin Z is obviously a very good candidate for that. There's other instruments, obviously, that I think are also part of the presentations today that are equally useful, perhaps, for specific questions. And when we first engaged in this area, trying to understand with colleagues from the NIH and from the EPA how to apply grade in this context, we actually produced a fairly simple Robbins I-based version of the Robbins E, which we evaluated in terms of measurement properties and so on, and that also worked pretty well. It was a precursor probably of Robbins E. So any risk of bias instrument is useful. We then identify studies that are relevant to a specific question, and as we already said, we evaluate risk of bias in grade by outcome of interest, because an exposure obviously can cause many, many outcomes. The items that are part of this instrument that I just showed, and that's very consistent with Robbins E, is confounding bias, selection bias, the measurement of exposures, any departures from the actual exposure, so co-exposures, for instance, or that exposure stops, missing data, measurement of the outcome, and reported results. So we do this on a study level, and if you want to use this heat map, as Chris Thayer likes to call it, then you start with an individual study that addresses an outcome of interest, and you do your assessment, hopefully after appropriate training in the relevant research methodologies to understand which items may be affected. And if you use these two tools, Robbins E or this precursor, there's 4 levels of risk of bias, as you know, that can be a rater can choose from, so low, moderate, serious, or critical risk of bias. And we do this across studies in this approach in order, again, to answer the question appropriately. And then at the end of the day, you have these type of risk of bias matrices, where in this case, we were looking at the exposure of BPA on prevalent overweight or obesity as an example. And you see that in these 6 studies, there were different concerns about the different items. That's also pretty obvious, I believe, or very, very intuitive. And that is a judgment, again, that can be done by several people with consensus, which is a good approach, of course, or it can be done by single people, checked by other individuals who are trained in order to understand if these judgments make sense. We ask, of course, like in any other risk of bias assessment or any assessment of evidence, that those raters or the assessors do provide a good rationale for why they believe that an item is actually affected by the study design. So then what you see here is that obviously based on that assessment, we can go out and assess the risk of bias that we believe exists for a certain estimate from a study, and do these assessments by study across the different domains that are described here, or items, as I like to call them, in the risk of bias domain. And there are different options, obviously, to say, okay, if there's a real problem, not now questioning the actual assessors, if there's a real problem on one of the domains, then this study may overall be at critical risk of bias. And you know, that is obviously also part of the Robbins E assessment. That is one way of thinking about it, and at the end of the day, then often you have lots of problems and you may have a very biased body of evidence. One way of thinking about it. Certainly not my preferred way of thinking about it, because no study is perfect. I have not done a perfect study in my life, although I've done many. And that is not the point to just say, everything is bad. An alternative way of thinking about it is obviously to look at the individual domains. And through sensitivity analyses in particular, to understand if individual domains have a major impact on the estimates of the effect, and then do an item level. Sorry, I'm struggling with this point. It's very sensitive, or I'm too rough, maybe. So that an assessment by domain by item is done, and that we try to understand if this item is really influential in terms of the overall estimate of the effect. Also, that is probably pretty obvious. So that at the end of the day, we have two possibilities. So, and oftentimes, or we prefer to have meta-analytical results for this particular purpose. And here's, for instance, the exposure outcome assessment for prevalent overweight. And we would have the possibility of doing sensitivity analysis. I hope this is visible. Yes, it's a great screen, actually. So what would happen in terms of the overall estimate of the risk, or the odds ratio in this case, if you included studies that were at particularly high risk of bias as opposed to not including them? Obviously, this should be part of your protocol, in particular also with identification of the confounders that you think are particularly important, and if they are not controlled for, that you assess those. And that will help you to understand, based on the protocol, systematic review protocol, whether or not these studies are influential and if they should be included or not included. That's a systematic review question. That's not a grade question. And we do this by outcome. That is just the point here, so that the same exercise can be undertaken if you have different outcomes, because it is not the same body of evidence that will describe or assess the association between an exposure and an outcome. It's often different studies, or it is studies that have measured multiple outcomes that then contribute different data to an overall assessment. Pretty obvious. Okay, so this can become pretty complicated. This is from another review. It's just an example that this overall, this judgment on a domain level for risk of bias can be complicated if you have many studies, and these sensitivity analyses can become complicated. But doing these sensitivity analyses by item is helpful, because it allows you then obviously also to understand if what you believed was an important confounder in this study, for instance, really had an overall effect on the estimate of the exposure assessment or the exposure outcome assessment. And it also helps you, I think, avoiding to just categorize studies where it is likely that they oftentimes end up as higher risk of bias, and these sensitivity analyses, if you were to just exclude studies based on those risk of bias items, would be probably problematic, because studies have different bias items. So just a few observations. The weighing of the domains or items for an overall assessment of risk of bias obviously requires considered judgment across these domains or items. Again, in Robbins E, they are called domains. I want to emphasize that in grade for us in grade is risk of bias is the domain, and the individual biases that you assess, such as confounding bias or selection bias, is an item. And the type of bias should not be equally weighted by default, we believe, because obviously that is depending on the question that you ask. And reducing bias through inclusion and exclusion of studies and sensitivity analysis may or may not come at a cost, obviously, of applicability or indirectness. And that is why, so this relates to that studies, if you were to just exclude them on the basis of a single risk of bias item, you might lose the contribution that these studies make, obviously, in having broader populations or slightly more nuanced exposures that you can then relate back to your question of interest. So that's the whole reason for doing it. Otherwise, you would just say, why not just exclude all of these studies that are at higher risk of bias? That would be, in a systematic review process, not ideal. And so that's again, this is not a grade specific approach, or it's not a approach that is specific to this topic. It's just simple and straightforward systematic review methodology. Risk of bias assessment should include an assessment of the direction, obviously, and if possible, the magnitude of risk of bias that results from these items. And in grade, I described the domain of opposing residual plausible confounding, and that should be integrated with the risk of bias assessment in some way or another. And these sensitivity analyses actually help you with understanding if there is residual plausible bias. And if you can exclude that, or if it would be actually opposing that might have an impact on you lowering your certainty in the evidence. But at the same time, because many of these studies do have a lot of confounding bias, we ask that raters really, really provide reasons, strong reasons, for not rating down for confounding bias. Because confounding remains a major issue, and of course, you might be able to control for that through analytical approaches, but I think not everybody would agree that you can fully control for it. So, in other words, you would look for reasons why you would not be concerned about, in particular, confounding bias. That is not everything. If we assess the certainty in a body of evidence, or the certainty that an exposure causes an effect, an outcome with a certain magnitude, in GRADE we define that as our certainty that an exposure causes an outcome with a certain effect, but that we are rating the certainty that the effect falls into a certain range or beyond a threshold, as opposed to the point estimate only. And not only the confidence interval, obviously, because that's the random piece of the certainty. All the other factors are systematic errors. So at the end of the day, just to provide that example, we would rate the certainty in studies that fulfill the inclusion criteria, either with or without the sensitivity analysis based on the protocol. We would describe the certainty that we have in a particular effect for risk of bias, inconsistency, indirectness, imprecision, and these rating up criteria, the evidence profiles would also provide relative estimates of the association as well as absolute estimates of the association. And we would provide reasons for why we ask that raters provide detailed reasons for why they think that they should be rating down, they should not be rating down, why there is bias or why there is no important bias across a body of evidence in explanatory footnotes. And as I said, GRADE is operationalized not only for this domain, risk of bias, but also for these other domains that I described, inconsistency, indirectness, imprecision, and so on, that I am not focusing on. So that is described in these explanatory footnotes. I just wanted to make a note on residual plausible confounding. I'm not the best person to talk about this for sure, but I wanted to provide a little bit of information about what has happened over the last few years. Thinking more about this is a paper that Jos Verbeek first authored, and it describes a four-step approach to basically judging or using the e-value, one statistical approach that addresses confounding in terms of how likely it would be that residual confounding can actually reduce an observed effect to null or below a threshold of interest. So this is an interesting read and a way of thinking about that. So with all of that, we are trying to make these certainty assessments transparent. This is from a paper that we did with Chris Thayer years ago that also talked about how one can quickly perform these assessments by having a structured approach using all of these domains. Here, for different scenarios of urgencies, the way that one would do it. I'm going to go to the relevant piece, actually. So these would be different scenarios for urgency of assessment, of an assessment between an exposure and an outcome. And depending on how much time there is, obviously, one would spend more time on doing the evidence synthesis as opposed to less. The point is that these domain-based assessments can still be done, even when it needs to be done very, very quickly. It's just providing a structure. So, and again, the rest of the table basically summarizes that in the overall certainty in the evidence that one might have. One note on evidence other than from humans. So it's perfectly legitimate, obviously, to focus on other species in the assessment of a exposure-outcome relationship. So for instance, if there are animal studies that provide a better estimate or a better study designs in particular, or lower risk of bias, then those might be used. I have to say that for decision making, we rarely use animal studies, although we have. There's one example that comes to mind, and that is when we did a guideline with WHO on the use of UV light to reduce the transmission of tuberculosis in TB wards and tuberculosis wards. The best evidence came from randomized experiments in rats at that time. And we utilized that evidence to make assessments also of the, in this case, intervention-outcome relationship, and felt that that evidence was sufficiently direct to use and better than the few observational studies that were there in humans. But of course, we had concerns about the absolute magnitude of the effect because we were extrapolating from another species to humans. And again, things like conclusions can be drawn on meta-analyses as well as on studies that don't have meta-analyses, even for domains like inconsistency and imprecision, by simply describing the results narratively. There's another paper that I'm just going to briefly introduce that talks with the frequently addressed topic. It talks about the frequently addressed topic in terms of how biological plausibility is considered in environmental health. And again, this is not to go through the paper in detail, but to make you aware of the fact that GRADE does consider biological plausibility, but it is not included as an explicit domain because we believe that it is primarily addressed through the use of surrogates and describing questions and hypotheses. So this may be useful, but anyway, so we have 10 examples in this paper, in this concept paper, in terms of how one can think about biological plausibility and why it might not be a separate domain. I'm using examples around the population and exposure outcome and how surrogates, both for the populations and the exposures, can be utilized to explain such relations. So at the end, this goes back to the paper with Chris Thayer. At the end, again, these ratings are done for each domain, and then at the end, one ends up with a summary statement that can be more trustworthy or less trustworthy depending on how much time one has. We describe 4 scenarios, so these ultra-short emergency responses where a decision maker has to give information within hours, to urgent responses, 1 to 2 weeks, rapid responses, 1 to 3 months, and then the routine responses where there's more time, often following these more urgent assessments, where there's more time to do a detailed assessment of not only the risk of bias, but also of the other domains. And that always ends with a summary statement. In this case, there may be either low certainty or moderate certainty, whatever the assessment reveals. Oops, this is because I use a Mac. I suspect I didn't check this slide. Anyways, so at the end we ask the question, what do we do with this body of evidence? In a hazard identification or risk assessment, this is work that Emily Sennert has been leading. As we said, we do a systematic review. We produce these evidence profiles with an assessment of a specific exposure after formulating a PECO question, so these questions can be different, and the evaluation of that exposure in its association with the outcome. But at the end of the day, when we use these evidence summaries, we often either present this to policymakers or we are in a position to make decisions, and other factors than just the certainty of the evidence play a role. So such as values, resources, cost effectiveness, and I always say that there are many, and you know that better than I do, that there are many examples for when we accept certain risks because there's other benefits that we assume so air pollution is always a great example. We accept certain levels of air pollution, although, of course, we try to reduce them because of the quality of life that we exert or because people need to be fed. There are these factors then, such as equity, acceptability, and feasibility that have an impact on the decisions that we make. And again, this brings us back to these questions, these PECO questions that we can ask when it comes to decisions. We typically are in this category 5 here. We are in a category where we say, okay, what exposures can we achieve through interventions? It may be a 0 exposure, or it may be certain levels of an exposure, and how does that affect the health effects, or how does that affect health, but also how does it affect other consequences, such as cost with the reduction of an exposure, or alternative interventions. So, and Emily went out and looked at what we had already done with European Commission funding, which is basically producing evidence to decision frameworks for different types of decisions, and asked the question, how do these evidence to decision frameworks actually apply to environmental and occupational health, where exposures are oftentimes the type of evidence that we are looking at, or then exposure intervention type of studies. And these are the criteria in the evidence to decision frameworks that I already mentioned. So it starts with how important is the problem, the desirable health effects, undesirable health effects, the certainty that we have in that, values that people place on the outcomes, then the balance of what we are achieving or what we are seeing, the resources that are required to do something about it, the certainty of the evidence around resource use, cost effectiveness, equity, acceptability, and feasibility. That was our starting point. And essentially what Emily found was that in existing evidence to decision frameworks and doing qualitative work, it didn't seem like there was something missing, but that operationalization of these criteria may be different in the exposure field or environmental health and occupational health field in particular. Another thing that emerged, and this is food for thought, that emerged is, and that was not covered, that in decision-making in general, that goes from clinical to public health decisions to probably risk-associated decisions, is that we should probably start thinking about planetary health, which is much more complicated, as a separate criterion. So I work a lot in the clinical and public health field, but almost any intervention has impact on the planet. And so what we are exploring right now is how to appropriately consider that, and you can imagine it's a very complicated topic. But again, some very simple clinical interventions such as anesthesia gases, or if you use an inhaler, like the little device or a pill, these all have planetary health impacts. Okay, and that is all that I had to say. So here is an advertisement to the Global Evidence Summit that focuses on evidence synthesis. For those of you who work in the evidence synthesis field, that's going to happen next year in the Czech Republic, and brings together folks who work on methods of evidence synthesis. But before I end, so my summary is that we do a cross-body of evidence risk of bias assessments, and any instrument can really serve. The focus is to do that across studies and across domains. Sensitivity analysis, in our view, are always needed. It then needs to be integrated with other domains that assess the overall certainty. But of course, we should first ask the right question. Thanks very much.